The moment the word left my mouth, the entire room stopped breathing. 30 of the most dangerous men in the city sat frozen, glasses halfway to their lips, eyes darting between me and the man seated at the head of the long table. Dorian Voss, the Black Iron Alpha, the name whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike with equal measures of fear and reverence, was staring at me with an expression I could not read. I had just called him cute. Out loud. To his face. In front of his entire organization. And somewhere in the back of my skull, a small, deeply unhelpful voice said, "Callum, you really should not have done that," and it was absolutely correct. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My name is Callum CO, and I want to be very clear about something before this story begins. I am not brave. I am not reckless. I am not the kind of Omega who walks into dangerous rooms and says dangerous things on purpose. I am, in fact, the exact opposite of all of those things. I am a 24-year-old florist who talks to his plants, cries at commercials, and once apologized to a bee for startling it. I am soft-spoken, anxious, and deeply committed to the philosophy of minding my own business, which makes it all the more baffling that I am currently standing in the private dining room of the Voss estate, surrounded by men whose combined criminal record would fill a library, having just called the most feared alpha on the eastern seaboard cute. But I am getting ahead of myself. Stories like this one do not begin at the moment of catastrophe. They begin much earlier in the small, ordinary moments that seem meaningless until you look back and realize that every single one of them was a step leading you straight to your undoing. My story began on a Tuesday morning in late October when a black car pulled up outside my shop. I'd owned Bloom and Thorn for 2 years by that point. It was a narrow little flower shop wedged between a dry cleaner and a dumpling restaurant on the quieter edge of Silvergate District, the kind of neighborhood that had once been dangerous and was now merely expensive. The shop had a green painted door that I repainted every spring, a hand-lettered sign I had done myself, and a perpetual smell of soil and cold water and something green and alive that I found more comforting than anything else on earth. It was mine. Like I had built it from nothing after leaving my family's house at 22, with $1,100, a duffel bag, and the specific kind of determination that only comes from having nothing left to lose. I was arranging a funeral display that morning, white chrysanthemums and pale blue hydrangeas, when the bell above the door rang and a man walked in, who did not belong in my shop. He was tall, wide-shouldered, and dressed in a dark coat that cost more than my monthly rent. His hair was black and cut close at the sides, his jaw was sharp enough to cast shadows, and his eyes were the color of gunmetal. He moved through the doorway with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once worried about whether there was enough room for him because the room always made room. He looked at me, then around at the flowers, then back at me, and said nothing for a long moment. "Can I help you?" I said, because that is what you say when someone walks into your shop, even if every instinct in your body is quietly suggesting that you ask them to leave. He slid a card across the counter. It was matte black with silver text. Just a name and a phone number. No title, no company. The name said Dorian Voss. "I want flowers," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that never needed to raise itself to be heard. I stared at the card. I had heard the name Dorian Voss exactly once before, 7 months ago, when my neighbor Mrs. Cho had leaned over her balcony railing and told me in a hushed voice that the Voss family had bought the old Meridian Hotel and that I should pray nothing like that ever moved into our neighborhood. When I had asked what the Voss family did, Mrs. Cho had given me a look that said the question itself was evidence of dangerous naivety, and told me that they ran half of what moved through the port, and she did not mean cargo. I looked up from the card. "What kind of flowers?" I said, because that is also what you say when someone walks into your shop, even if your voice is slightly higher than usual. He told me. He wanted a standing arrangement for a funeral, something for the entrance hall of a private estate, something for the center of a long dining table, and a weekly delivery of whatever I thought was appropriate for each of the other rooms. He listed the rooms without looking at a list. He said it the way someone lists the rooms of a house they have never had to describe because they have always simply existed within it. I told him I could do all of that. Right? He said he would send someone with the deposit. He turned to leave, and that should have been the end of it, except that just before he reached the door, he paused at a small arrangement I had done for the display shelf, a cluster of dark anemones and silvery, dusty miller that I had put together that morning for no reason other than that I liked the way they looked. He studied it for a moment. Then he picked it up very carefully with both hands, the way you pick up something you do not want to damage, and turned it slightly in the light. Something about the gesture struck me. There was something almost gentle in it, something that did not belong to the rest of him. The coat and the card and the voice and the way he occupied space. It was the gesture of someone who noticed small things, who cared privately about beauty. It was, and I am aware of how this sounds, unexpectedly sweet. The deposit arrived that afternoon via courier. It was 6 times what I had quoted. I called the number on the card to tell them there had been a mistake. The man who answered told me there had not been a mistake, and that Mr. Voss expected perfect work and paid accordingly. Then he told me the first delivery was expected Friday, and ended the call. I stood in my shop holding the phone for a full minute before I said, out loud and to no one, "Well, okay then." Friday came. I loaded the van with the funeral arrangement, which I had done in white and silver, and the dining table piece, which I had done in deep burgundy and forest green because it had felt right, and the weekly arrangements for the other rooms, which I had done in different tones for each space based on nothing more than instinct, and a very clear memory of the way he had held that cluster of anemones. I drove to the address on the confirmation message and pulled up to a gate that was tall and iron and absolutely not the kind of gate you see outside homes that belong to people who live uncomplicated lives. A man came out to meet me. He was shorter than the gate and wearing an earpiece and an expression that had never in its life been friendly. He checked my name against something on his phone, told me to back the van to the side entrance, and watched me unload everything without offering to help and without looking away. I smiled at him twice. He did not smile back. I told myself he probably just had a condition and left it at that. The arrangements were placed. I was escorted out. I drove home. That should have been the end of it. Except that Sunday morning I received a message from the same number. The dining room arrangement. What did you put in the center? I messaged back. Burgundy dahlias, eucalyptus, dark ivy, hellebores. Another pause. Then, why? I stared at the message. Why is not a question that florists usually get asked. I typed back, the room faces west. Evening light through west windows turns red gold. The burgundy catches it. The green keeps it from being too heavy. It should look like something old and comfortable at dinner time. There was a long pause. Then, correct. Deliver the same next Friday. I put my phone down. I was inexplicably pleased about this, which was probably the first warning sign that I should have paid more attention to. The deliveries continued. Every Friday for 3 weeks. The man with the earpiece, whose name I eventually learned was Reston, remained impossible to charm. The arrangements remained correct, apparently, because the messages came regularly now, small observations or corrections that I came to think of as the closest thing to a compliment that man was capable of producing. The roses in the second sitting room. Too many. The white freesias in the hallway. Leave them. They smell like something my mother kept. The orchids on the landing. Perfect. Keep those. I found myself looking forward to the messages more than I should have. I told myself it was professional satisfaction. I was very convincing. The 4th Friday changed everything. I arrived at the side entrance as usual. Reston was not there. A different man met me. Younger. A little less practiced at the blank expression, and slightly agitated. He told me there had been a change, and that Mr. Voss wanted to see the arrangements placed himself today. He told me to follow him through the main entrance. I followed him through a hallway that smelled of cedar and old wood polish, past paintings I did not have time to look at properly, and through a door into the dining room. Dorian Voss was standing at the far end of the table with 2 other men, looking at something spread across the surface. Documents. A map, possibly. The men with him were large and serious, and the kind of serious that was not about spreadsheets. He looked up when I entered. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a room shifts when you open a window. He excused himself from the other men, who gathered the documents with practiced efficiency and left without being asked to. He walked to where I was standing with my boxes and my arrangements, and my deep mounting awareness that I had just interrupted something and absolutely should not have interrupted, and he said, "Show me what you brought." I showed him. I talked him through each arrangement the way I always did when a client wanted to understand the thinking. I told him why I had changed the hallway piece from the previous week, and the late autumn light had shifted and the white freesias were no longer catching it correctly, so I had moved to something warmer, amber chrysanthemums and dried lunaria, the kind with the silver moon-shaped seed pods that catch light even when there is not much of it. I told him why I had kept the orchids exactly the same on the landing, because they were correct, and there is no reason to change something correct just for the sake of change. He listened. He actually listened, not the way that people listen when they are waiting for you to finish, but the way people listen when the information matters to them. He asked one question about the chrysanthemums, whether they would last the week. I told him they would if the temperature in the hallway stayed consistent. He nodded and said he would have the heating adjusted. And then something happened that I did not plan and cannot adequately explain. He was looking at the orchids on the landing display I had just finished placing, and the afternoon light was doing exactly what I had hoped it would do, falling across his face at an angle that softened everything. The sharp jaw, the gunmetal eyes, didn't hurt the permanent slight furrow between his brows, and for just one unguarded moment, with the light on him and his attention fully on something beautiful and completely harmless, he looked like something other than what he was. He looked like someone who had once, a long time ago, been a person who could be startled by small, beautiful things. He looked like someone who still was, privately, when no one was watching. And I thought, he is actually quite cute. And then, God help me, I said it. He is actually quite cute. Out loud. To the room. Which was not empty. Because I had not noticed that Reston had come back, and that 2 other men had come in behind him, and that somewhere in the previous 60 seconds, 4 additional people had entered the dining room for reasons that were absolutely not flower-related. Door 30 was an exaggeration. There were 6 of them, but 6 men going completely, absolutely, breathlessly silent all at once, in a room that had been perfectly quiet to begin with, creates a very particular kind of silence that has genuine weight to it. I felt it land on my shoulders like something physical. I turned slowly. Dorian Voss was looking at me. The 6 other men were looking at me. Nobody moved. I would like to tell you that I handled the next moment with grace. I would like to tell you that I said something clever, something that recontextualized the statement, something that allowed everyone present to conclude that they had misheard, or that the remark had been directed at the orchids or at the architectural detail above the window, or at literally anything other than the man standing 4 feet away from me. What I actually said was the arrangement. I was talking about the arrangement. The way the light hits it. It is a cute effect, floristically speaking. Nobody in that room had ever heard the word floristically before. I was quite sure of that. I was also quite sure that I had not used it correctly. I was additionally quite sure that every single person in that room, including the man with the gunmetal lace who was still looking at me with an expression that had not changed by a single millimeter, knew exactly what I had meant, and exactly what I had said, and exactly who I had said it about. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Then Dorian Voss said quietly to the room in general, "Leave us." They left, every one of them, with a speed that told me they were not leaving because they wanted to, but because they absolutely had to, and that the order to leave had carried the specific frequency of a command from a man whose commands were not suggestions. The door closed. We were alone. I stood very still with my empty flower box in my hands and my heart conducting a full orchestra in my chest. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Floristically speaking," it was not a question. It was a repetition, with a very specific intonation that I could not identify as either amused or dangerous. It occupied a space directly between the two that I found deeply uncomfortable. "Yes," I said. I was describing the aesthetic quality of the composition. It is a technical term. He looked at me. I looked at the orchids. The orchids offered no help. He said, "It is not a technical term." I said no. Another pause. Then something happened that I did not expect at all. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the faintest precursor to a smile, the kind of movement that a smile makes underground before it reaches the surface, like something growing beneath soil in early spring that you can feel there without being able to see it yet. It lasted approximately 1 second, and then it was gone, and his face was composed and unreadable again. He said, "Friday deliveries only. Come to the front entrance from now on." And that was all. I gathered my boxes and I left, and I drove back to my shop in a state of profound personal confusion. And then I sat behind my counter for 20 minutes, arranging and rearranging a handful of dried lavender before I admitted to myself that my hands were shaking. Not from fear. The following Friday I came to the front entrance. Reston met me there, and something in his expression had shifted by exactly 1 millimeter in a direction I could not name. He did not smile. He never smiled. But he held the door open without being asked, and he said, Mr. Voss is in the library, which was not information I needed for the purpose of delivering flowers, but was information I received, so I received it and I said thank you and I went inside. The deliveries that day went the same as always, except that at the end, when I was packing my box near the front door, the door to the library at the end of the hall was open, and I could see, right from that distance, a man sitting at a desk reading something. He did not look up, but just before I reached the front door, his voice came down the hallway, unhurried and even. The Lunaria in the hallway. Leave those until they drop on their own. I stopped. I said, they will scatter seed pods on the floor. He said, I know. I said, it will make a mess. There was a pause. Then, I am aware of what falling seed pods do, Mr. Seo. I said, right. Yes. Okay, I left. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the weekend, which was embarrassing, but it happened anyway. I want to tell you something about Omega biology, because it matters to this story, and I want to be honest about the ways in which I was not entirely in control of what was happening to me. Omegas are designed, at a fundamental chemical level, are to respond to alpha presence. It is not a weakness. It is not a flaw. It is simply a fact of the body, the same way that certain flowers turn toward light, not because they choose to, but because the chemistry of their cells compels them. When an alpha is nearby, certain things happen. Pheromone receptors activate. Awareness sharpens. The body pays attention in ways it does not have conscious control over. This is not love. This is not attraction, necessarily. This is simply the biological reality of existing in a world built around paired dynamics. What I am saying is that the way I noticed Dorian Voss, the way I registered his presence every time I walked into that house, the way my body oriented toward him, the way the Lunaria oriented toward the window, that was chemistry. I was not choosing it. What I felt beyond the chemistry, now that was something else entirely. And it grew so gradually that I did not notice it growing until it was already quite large. The 6th delivery was the one where things changed properly. I arrived on a Friday in mid-November to find the front entrance unguarded and the door slightly ajar, which had never happened before. I let myself in the way you let yourself into a house where no one answers, but the door is already open, and which is to say cautiously and with a growing sense that something is not as it should be. The hallway was quiet, but not empty. I could hear voices from somewhere deeper in the house, low and sharp, the specific timbre of voices engaged in something serious. I started on the hallway arrangement because it was nearest the door, and therefore nearest the exit. I was halfway through replacing the Lunaria, which had indeed scattered its seed pods across the floor in a way that was genuinely beautiful, and which I absolutely was not going to mention to him. When I heard the voices get louder, then stop, then a door opened somewhere down the corridor. 2 men came down the hallway. They were not Reston's type of serious. They were a different kind of serious, the kind that has a specific quality of threat attached to it, a particular energy that Omega instinct reads before the conscious mind processes it. They clocked me immediately. One of them stopped. The other kept walking toward me with the deliberate pace of someone who wants you to understand that the space you occupy is not actually yours. He said something that I will not repeat here except to say that it referenced my presentation and status as an unmated Omega in a way that was designed to make me feel unsafe. And it worked, because I am not brave, I am a florist. And I was standing in a hallway holding a handful of dry Lunaria with nowhere to go. And then Dorian Voss appeared at the end of the corridor. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. He walked at his normal pace, which was unhurried and deliberate, and somehow covered the distance faster than it should have. He came to stand between me and the man who had spoken, and the shift in the air in that hallway was immediate and total, the way weather changes before a storm, the way a room recognizes when the most dangerous thing in it has decided to pay attention. He said something to the man, quietly. Kik-sun, I did not hear all of it because my pulse was too loud in my ears, but I heard enough. I heard the word again, and I heard the word leave, and I heard a very specific quality of silence from the man he was speaking to, the silence of someone who has just been reminded of the full weight of the person in front of them. They left, both of them, without another word. Dorian Voss turned to look at me. I was still holding the Lunaria. My hands had gone slightly cold. He said, "Are you all right?" It was not asked with softness exactly. It was asked with directness, the way someone asks a question when they actually want to know the answer, and are not interested in the polite version. I said, "Yes, fine, thank you." He looked at me for a moment, then he looked at the Lunaria in my hands. He said, "You left them too long. They've already scattered." I said, You told me to leave them until they dropped on their own." He said, "I did." He reached past me and picked up one of the seed pods from the floor. He held it up to the window light. The silver membrane caught it and turned it translucent, thin as paper and gleaming. He looked at it the same way he had looked at the anemones that first morning in my shop, with that private attention that did not belong to the rest of him. He said quietly and to himself more than to me, "My mother used to call these moon coins." I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only correct response to something that is not meant for you, but that you have been given anyway. He set the seed pod down on the ledge of the windowsill very carefully and said, "Finish the arrangement. Someone will see you out when you are done." He walked back down the corridor. The door at the end closed softly. I stood in the hallway for a long moment with my cold hands in my lunarian, the seed pod on the windowsill, and the specific gathering ache of beginning to feel something for someone that you absolutely should not feel anything for. I finished the arrangement. I left. I did not tell anyone about the two men. I told myself it was because there was nothing useful to tell, and everything had been handled. The truth was more complicated than that, and I was not ready to look at it yet. The 7th delivery was 3 days later than usual because I had a family order that required all my time at the end of that week, and I sent a message through the number explaining the delay. The reply came within minutes. Understood. Bring something for a dinner party. 14 guests. Saturday evening. He gave me a time and then added, "It is not a formal occasion." I spent 2 days on the Saturday arrangements, not because 14 guest centerpieces are especially complicated, but because I kept changing my mind about what was right. I had never met the guests. I did not know the tone of the evening. I had only the house and the man and the collection of small observations I had accumulated over 2 months of Fridays. The way he had held the anemones, the way he had said moon coins, the way he looked at things he thought no one was watching him look at, the way the afternoon light moved through the west windows. I brought deep red ranunculus and blackberries on the stem, and small branches of smoke bush, the kind with the feathery burgundy clouds of seed that look like something between a flower and a memory. Oh, I brought candlelight amber for the secondary arrangements, and left the entrance piece stark and simple, white, green, and one statement branch of bare black dogwood, elegant without trying. The kind of arrangement that suggests the party inside it is not worried about impressing anyone. I arrived at 4 to set up before the guests. Reston met me at the door, and I had now known Reston long enough to read the variations of his neutral expression. And today's variation said something was different about this evening. Not wrong, just different in a way that called for alertness. The dining room was already laid when I entered. Someone had set the table with dark linens and crystal that caught everything. I placed the centerpiece and worked around the edges with the secondary arrangements. And I was finishing the last of them when the door opened and Dorian Voss came in. He was dressed for the evening. Dark suit, no tie. The top button of his shirt open in a way that was not careless but deliberate. The distinction that separates a man who does not bother from a man who knows precisely what effect he is producing. He looked at the table, then at the arrangements, then at me. He said, "The entrance piece." I said, "Bold choice. If you hate it, I can replace it before your guests arrive." But I thought the starkness would make a statement. It says the person who lives here has specific taste, not just expensive taste. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I will keep it." He walked to the table and adjusted one of the wine glasses by a millimeter. Not because it needed adjusting, but because it was something to do while he said what he said next. He said, "You will stay for the dinner." I said, "I am the florist." He said, "You will stay for the dinner. You can sit at the end near the kitchen door if you prefer. Or at the table. It is not a formal occasion." I looked at him. He looked at the wine glass he had just straightened. I said, "I do not own dinner clothes." He said, "What you are wearing is fine." I was wearing dark trousers and a green linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up in soil under my thumbnail that I had not managed to completely remove. But he said it was fine with the same tone he used to say that the orchids on the landing were correct, which was a tone that did not leave room for argument. I stayed. The guests arrived at 7. There were 11 of them. Not 14, and I quickly understood that they were not the kind of guests who told each other what they did for work. They were a particular category of person, and people whose entire manner suggested that their real life happened somewhere other than in public, and that everything visible was a carefully selected portion of something larger and more complex. They moved through the dining room with the comfort of people who had been in rooms like this before, and they spoke to each other in that particular shorthand of people who have shared history and shared interests that cannot be discussed in full sentences. I sat at the end of the table nearest the kitchen door. I was introduced as Callum without elaboration, and nobody asked for elaboration, which suggested they were all either very polite or very well trained. And dinner was extraordinary. I ate things I could not name and drank wine that tasted like it had been waiting a very long time to be opened. I spoke when spoken to, which was more often than I expected, because the man to my left, who had very warm eyes and a scar along his jawline, seemed genuinely interested in flowers, and the woman across from me, who introduced herself only as Pyrrha, asked me detailed questions about the smoke bush and whether it could be grown in a northern climate. I watched Dorian Voss at the head of the table. I watched the way he managed the room without appearing to manage it, the way the conversation moved where he let it move and stopped when he introduced something new, the way he listened to the man 3 seats down who was clearly delivering information in the form of a dinner conversation story. The way his eyes occasionally found me at the end of the table and then moved away, calmly, unhurried. After the main course, the man with the warm eyes leaned toward me and said very quietly, "You are not what I expected." I said, "I am sorry. Was there an expectation?" He said, "There is always an expectation for anyone Dorian brings into this house. He is not in the habit of importing people from outside the circle." I said, "I am the florist." He smiled in a way that said he found this answer both technically accurate and fundamentally insufficient. The dinner ended at 11. The guests left in the order they had arrived, which I suspected was not coincidental. When the last of them had gone, I began gathering the few things I had brought in with me, and Reston appeared to tell me the car was ready to take me home, which was also something that had never happened before, the previous arrangement having always been that I drove myself. I said, "I drove myself here." Reston said, "Mr. Voss prefers you take the car. Your van will be looked after." I said, "My van does not need looking after. It is in the driveway." Reston said, "Mr. Voss prefers." I looked at Reston. Reston looked at me. I'd met Walls with more give than Reston when he was delivering one of Mr. Voss's preferences, so I picked up my bag and I went with the car. It was a long, quiet drive across the city to Silvergate District. The driver did not speak. The city outside the window was lit and moving. I sat in the back with my hands in my lap and thought about a man who put a seed pod on a windowsill and told me the orchids were correct and invited a florist to stay for a dinner party and said that what I was wearing was fine, and then sent a car to take me home. I thought about chemistry, and I thought about the lunaria scattering its moon coins on the floor, and I thought about the word cute, and the silence that had followed it, and the thing that had moved in the corner of his mouth that was not yet a smile. By the time the car pulled up outside my shop, I had arrived at no conclusions, except one. Friday was too far away. The next morning my phone buzzed at 7:45. The message was from the number I had saved as Voss Estate. It said the Dogwood branch, the entrance piece. Can it be done with something that has bark like that but carries a blossom? I typed back immediately before I had even fully woken up. Paperbark cherry. Similar architectural quality. White blossoms in early spring. We are not yet in spring, so the branch would be bare, but the bark itself is extraordinary. It peels in thin copper layers. It catches light differently from the dogwood. There was a pause. Then, "Show me one. Bring a branch on Wednesday." It was Monday. He was asking me to come on a day that was not Friday. I put my phone down and looked at the ceiling and said out loud to the empty room, "This is a terrible idea, Callum." My shop had a small back room where I kept the more unusual inventory, the branches and the dried botanicals and the things that did not live in the front display cases. For an on, I went back there and I found 2 paperbark cherry branches that I had been keeping for a late autumn arrangement, and I held them up to the light coming through the small window. And I thought about what the copper bark would look like in the hallway of a house that faced west with the afternoon light coming through. I thought it would be perfect. I went on Wednesday. Reston met me at the front door and did not comment on the fact that it was not Friday. He held the door. I went in. I found Dorian Voss in the entrance hall studying the blank space where the dogwood branch had been. I held up the paperbark cherry branches. He looked at them. He took one from me, carefully, both hands, the way he always handled things from me, and held it up to the afternoon light coming through the fanlight above the door. The copper bark caught it. While the light moved across the peeling layers and turned them amber and gold, the same color as the afternoon through the west windows, the same warmth as the ranunculus from the dinner party. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes." He handed it back. Our fingers overlapped for exactly 1 second. Neither of us moved immediately. Then he stepped back, and I turned to place the branch in the entrance vase. And I was very focused on this task, and not at all on the warmth that lingered on my fingertips. He said from behind me, "Stay for tea." I said to the vase, "I have a delivery." He said, "Your delivery is not until 4. It is currently 2:15. I said, "How do you know when my deliveries are?" He said nothing. I turned around. He was looking at me with that expression that gave nothing away and everything simultaneously. Or the expression I had spent 8 weeks slowly learning to read like a language I was not supposed to be studying. I said yes. "All right. Tea." We had tea in the room off the library that I had not been in before, a smaller room, slightly warmer, with 2 chairs angled toward me and a fireplace that was lit, despite it not being particularly cold, and a table between them that held a tea service that someone had already prepared, which meant he had expected me to say yes. I sat down. He poured. He handed me a cup. Our fingers did not touch this time. He sat across from me, and he said, "Tell me about the paperbark cherry." So I told him. I told him about the bark that peels like paper and the blossoms that come in early spring, white and simple, and the way the tree looks in winter, stripped and architectural, its copper and amber skin glowing against gray sky. I told him it is not a tree that shows off. It waits. It holds itself in for the winter, and then when the conditions are right, it opens completely, white flowers everywhere, unstoppable. He listened. He looked at the fire. He said, "The shop. You have had it 2 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "Before that." I said, "I worked for other florists. Before that, I did a degree in botany that I did not finish because I needed to work." He said, "Family." I said, "We are not close." He said nothing for a moment, and I understood somehow that this was not a subject he would press. I said, "You." He looked at me. I said, "The estate. Were you born here?" He said, "No. My family had a smaller house on the east side of the city. Not this neighborhood." I said, "But you stayed in the city." And he said, "I have reasons to stay." I said, "Business." He said, "Among other things." He looked at the fire again. He said quietly, almost to himself, "My mother's garden had a paperbark cherry. I'd have forgotten that until you showed me the branch." I said nothing. Again, because some things are given to you that you are not supposed to have, but that you receive anyway. And the correct response is to receive them carefully. He said, "She died 9 years ago." I said, "I am sorry." He said, "She liked things that were not obvious. She said the best things required patience." We sat with that for a moment. The fire moved. The tea cooled slightly. I said, "I think she was right." He looked at me. The light from the fire was on his face the way the afternoon light had been on the day I said the word I was not supposed to say. And his expression was the same, that unguarded quality that appeared when his attention was fully occupied by something that did not require him to be what he was to the rest of the world. I thought it again. The same thing I had thought before. Exactly the same thought. Warm and unbidden and absolutely none of my business. I did not say it this time. I drank my tea. He said, "Friday." I said, "Yes." He said, "Come to the front entrance." I said, "I always do now." He said, "Yes." I put down my cup. I stood. He stood also, which he had not done before when I left, and he walked me to the door himself, and he opened it, and I went out into the November afternoon with the paperbark cherry established in the entrance hall behind me, and the specific, impossible, thoroughly inconvenient knowledge that I was in serious trouble. While I drove back to my shop, I put the remaining paperbark cherry branch in water. I sat down behind the counter. I said, "Callum, you are falling in love with the most dangerous man in Silvergate District." My phone buzzed. It was the number. The tea was good, it said. "Bring the same blend on Friday." I looked at the message for a very long time. I typed back, "It was your tea." A pause. Then, "I know. I wanted to see if you would correct me." I put the phone face down on the counter, and I covered my face with both hands, and I sat there for a while. The problem with falling for someone like Dorian Voss is not the danger, although the danger is real and substantial and should not be minimized. The problem is that the danger is not what you focus on, or it's what you focus on is the seed pod on the windowsill and the tea that he already knew was his, and the way he said my mother liked things that were not obvious in a voice that was both very quiet and very far away. What you focus on is the floristry of it. The way certain things take time, the way certain things wait for the right conditions, the way certain things look like nothing in winter and then open completely when spring comes. What you focus on is the corner of his mouth that is not yet a smile, but that is moving underground, like something growing in early spring. I am not Brove. I am not reckless. I am a florist who talks to his plants and cries at commercials and apologizes to a bee. But I kept going back on Fridays, and now on Wednesdays. And when the messages came, I answered them immediately, or before I had thought too carefully about what I was doing. And 3 weeks after the tea in the small warm room by the fire, on a Friday afternoon in the early December, Reston met me at the front door and told me that Mr. Voss had a situation that required his attention, but that I should continue with the deliveries and that someone would see me out when I was finished. The situation, I learned, was in the dining room. There were voices when I reached the hallway outside. The door was not fully closed. The voices were not raised, but they had that specific quality of voices that are not raised because the people speaking them do not need to raise them to convey exactly what they mean, which is more unsettling than shouting. I should not have stopped. I should not have listened. I am telling you this not as an excuse, but as context for what happened next, which is that I stopped because one of the voices was Dorian Voss's, and the other was a voice I did not recognize, and the tone of the exchange had the texture of something going wrong. The stranger's voice said, "The SSIO boy, the florist." "You're being careless, Dorian." Dorian's voice said, "My arrangements inside this house are not your concern." The stranger said, "Everything inside this house is my concern. You know that. He is an unmated omega with no connections and no protection. If someone with less patience than me decides he has useful leverage..." Dorian said, "He is under my protection." There was a pause. The stranger said, "You have not told him that." Dorian said, "He does not need to know the details of his protection to be protected." Another pause. Longer this time. The stranger said, "You're compromised." Dorian said nothing. The stranger said, "I have not seen you compromised before." Dorian said very quietly, "Leave." I backed away from the door. I went back to the entrance hall. I finished the arrangements. I packed my boxes. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because my mind was doing something loud and complicated, under my protection. He does not need to know the details. You are compromised. Reston appeared to see me out. At the door I stopped. I said, "Reston, is there something I should know? About why I come here? About the arrangement?" Reston looked at me for a long moment with that carefully neutral expression that I'd spent 3 months learning to read. He said, "Mr. Voss will tell you himself, when he is ready." I said, "Is it soon?" Reston said, "I expect so." I went to my van. I sat in the driver's seat. I looked at the front door of the house. The front door opened. Dorian Voss came out. He crossed the short distance to the van in that unhurried way of his, and he stopped beside the driver's window. I rolled it down. He said, "You heard." I said, "Some of it." He said, "I should have told you earlier." I said, "Told me what exactly?" He said, 2 months ago, when you first came to this house. Someone noticed. Someone who uses information about people close to me. I took steps. You are not in danger. But the protection requires your continued presence here, which is why the arrangement has continued on terms that are, I am aware, not entirely standard for a florist and a client. I looked at him. He looked at me. Our December air was cold and the light was going, and his breath made small clouds in the air between us. I said, "And the tea?" A pause. I said, "And the dinner party, and the Wednesday visits, and the paper-bark cherry, and the moon coins, and the fire." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Those were not for protection." The breath went out of me slowly. He said, "I am not good at this. I want you to know that. I am not practiced at wanting things that are not tactical." I said, "I know." He said, "You know." I said, "You look at arrangements the way you look at people you would like to keep. You hold things carefully with both hands. You remember things. You're not as closed as you want people to think." He was quiet for a long moment. I said, "I called you cute." He said, "Yes." I said, "In front of 6 of your men." He said, "Yes." And I said, and the room went dead silent. He said, "Yes." I said, "And you sent them all away?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Because you wanted to be alone with the florist who had just called you cute." He said, I needed to establish whether you were suicidal or simply unaware of your situation. I said, which did you conclude? He said, the second, with significant evidence for the first. I laughed. It came out before I could stop it, clear and genuine, and I watched the corner of his mouth move again, that underground movement, and this time it came all the way up. It was brief. It was quiet. It was the smallest smile I'd ever seen on another person's face, but it was real. And it was for me. He said, come inside. It is cold. I turned off the van engine. He opened the van door and I got out and we walked back across the stone path to the front door of the house, side by side, not touching yet, but close enough that his warmth was perceptible in the cold air, close enough that the cedar and smoke of him wrapped around me like something familiar, like something that had been there a long time already. Reston held the door. As I passed him, I was almost certain his expression shifted by 2 millimeters. Still not a smile, but closer. I stepped inside. The paper-bark cherry glowed copper in the light of the entrance hall. The house smelled of cedar and old wood pollen and faintly from somewhere deeper tea. I thought, this is the beginning of something. I thought, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I thought, the best things require patience. That night, Edward Dorian Voss told me everything. Not all at once. Not in a single speech delivered to the fireplace while I sat in the good chair and listened. It came out the way difficult things tend to come out, in pieces, in the spaces between other sentences, in the long silences that neither of us filled because neither of us needed to. We sat in the small, warm room off the library, the same chairs, the same fire, and he talked and I listened and the night moved around us without either of us marking its passage. He told me about the man in the dining room. His name was Soren Kale, and he was the senior figure in the network that Dorian's family had been part of for 3 generations, the kind of network that does not have a name because names create evidence. Soren Kale was not Dorian's enemy. He was something more complicated than that. Doricedo's superior in the structure that Dorian had been born into, a man who had known Dorian since childhood, and who had watched him take over the Voss operation at 26 when Dorian's father died, and who had, for 12 years, treated that operation as something he had certain rights over. Soren Kale had noticed me. He had noticed me not because I was important to him, but because I was potentially important to Dorian, and anything potentially important to Dorian was a potential instrument of influence. This was how his mind worked. This was how minds like his always worked. The people around a powerful person are not people to someone like Soren Kale. They are pressure points. Dorian had known this the moment Soren's man had followed his usual black car from the estate to Silvergate District on the second Friday, where he had moved immediately. He had put measures in place, quiet ones, the kind that do not announce themselves, people stationed near my shop at intervals I would not notice, a driver who would be available if I needed to move quickly, an understanding with the buildings on either side of my shop whose owners owed Dorian considerations of various kinds. He had done all of this in the space of 48 hours without telling me, because the telling, he said, would have required him to explain why he was doing it, and explaining why he was doing it would have required him to say something that he was not yet sure how to say. I said, and now? He looked at the fire. He said, now Soren has made it clear he is watching, which means the informal protection is no longer sufficient, which means I need to make the situation unambiguous. And I said, unambiguous how? He said, if you are under formal protection, if the structure understands that you are, then you are not a pressure point. You are off limits. I said, what does formal protection mean in the context of your structure? He said, still looking at the fire, it means a claim, a declared bond, something that the structure recognizes as non-negotiable. I was quiet for a moment. I said, you are describing a bonding declaration? He said, yes. I said, between us. He said, yes. I said, Dorian. He looked at me then. His expression was the most open I had ever seen it, the most unguarded, the armor entirely absent in a way that I suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to witness. He said, I want to be clear about something. The declaration would protect you, that is true, but that is not the only reason I am suggesting it. I told you earlier that the teas and the dinners and the Wednesdays were not for protection. I meant that. This is also not only for protection. I said you have known me for 3 months. He said yes. I said I'm a florist. He said yes. I said you run the most significant criminal network on the eastern seaboard. He said among other things. I said those things are not compatible. He said, I know. I said, and yet. He said, and yet. I looked at my hands. I looked at the fire. I looked at the paperbark cherry branch visible through the open doorway in the hall, catching the last of the evening light. I said, You're the first person who has ever asked me why I chose an arrangement, who wanted to know the thinking behind it, not just the result. He said nothing. When I said, You put a seed pod on the windowsill and did not move it. You told me to leave the lunaria until it dropped on its own. You learned when my deliveries were scheduled so you could argue with me about whether I had time for tea. You walked me to the door. He said yes. I said, I am not saying yes to a bonding declaration because it keeps me safe. He said, I know. I said, I am saying yes because I have been thinking about you at the wrong hours of the day since the first time you picked up the anemones with both hands like they were something that mattered. His breath changed. Not obviously. Just slightly. The way breathing changes when something has landed that you did not fully expect, even when you were hoping for it. He said, Callum. It was the first time he had used my name, not Mr. C.O., not said to rest and order the room. My name and his voice quiet and certain and belonging to nobody else in that moment. I said yes, not to the declaration only, to all of it, to the tea and the Fridays and the fire and whatever came after the fire, to the man who was not as closed as he wanted people to think, who held small, beautiful things carefully with both hands, who put moon coins on window sills and had a mother who liked things that were not obvious. He said, Come here. I stood. I crossed the small distance between the chairs and I stood in front of him and he reached up and took my hand and then he stood too. And we were very close in the warm light of the fire and he looked at me for a long moment the way he looked at arrangements when he was deciding if they were correct, with that complete and unhurried attention. Then he leaned in, slowly, giving me every opportunity to change what I had said. I did not change it. His mouth was warm and careful, and he kissed me the way he held things, deliberately with both hands, as though the moment was something that mattered and he was not willing to handle it without full attention. And I kissed him back and thought, distantly and without much coherence, about paperbark cherry trees that wait all winter and then open completely. When we separated, his forehead came down to rest against mine. His hands were at my face, and his thumbs moved in slow arcs along my jaw, and the cedar and smoke of him was all around me, familiar in the way that only things you have been approaching gradually for a long time finally become familiar when you arrive at them. He said quietly, I have wanted to do that since the 7th delivery. Joanne said, I have wanted to do that since I called you cute and you sent everyone out of the room. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, low and warm and private, and I felt it against my forehead and thought, I will remember this. I will remember this for a very long time. The bonding declaration was made the following week. It was not a ceremony. It was a meeting, in a building I was not told the address of in advance, attended by people whose names I was not given. Dorian and I arrived together. We sat side by side at a table that reminded me, in its dark wood and its length, of his dining table at home. Soren Kale was there. He sat across from us and looked at me with the flat, assessing expression of someone taking the inventory, and I looked back at him with what I hoped was a calm I did not entirely feel. Dorian spoke. He was brief and precise. He declared the bond. He named me specifically by full name, by dynamic status, by the specific protections that attached. The language was formal, and I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough. I understood that he was telling this room, this table, these people, that I was his, and that the word his carried with it an absolute and non-negotiable set of consequences for anyone who chose to test it. Soren Kale said nothing for a long moment when Dorian finished. Then he looked at me and said, You are an unusual choice. I said, I have been told. He said, He does not make choices like this. I said, I know. He said, No, you're not afraid of me. I said, I did not say that. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. And the flat inventory quality was replaced by something more considered. He said, You will do. Dorian said very quietly, He is not here for your approval, Soren. Soren looked at Dorian for a moment. Then he inclined his head fractionally, the specific gesture of someone who has decided to concede a point without conceding the war. We left. In the car on the way home, Dorian's hand found mine on the seat between us. He did not say anything. Neither did I. The city moved past the windows, and his thumb traced a slow line across my knuckles, and I thought about the word his, and felt for the first time in a very long time that it did not frighten me. There is something I should tell you about the weeks that followed. They were not without difficulty. The declaration changed things inside the house in ways that were warm and good, like in ways I will come to. But it also changed things outside the house, and those changes were not all good, and I want to be honest about that because I am a florist who values accuracy, and the accurate version of this story includes the parts that were hard. And the first hard thing was my shop. 3 days after the declaration, I arrived at Bloom and Thorn to find that the green painted door had been painted over. Not defaced exactly, just painted, in the same shade, so precisely that the only way you could tell it had been done was that the color was slightly too fresh, slightly too even. Without the small imperfections of the door I had repainted myself every spring. Someone had been in my shop, not to take anything, to make a point, to let me know that they could. I stood in front of the door for a long moment, and then I took out my phone and called the Voss estate number. Dorian answered himself, which he had never done before. He said, "I know. I already know." "Are you inside the shop?" And I said, "Not yet." He said, "Wait outside. Someone is coming. Someone came in 4 minutes." It was a man I had not seen before, quiet and efficient, who checked the inside of the shop while I stood on the pavement outside it with my arms folded and my heart doing something unpleasant in my chest. He came out and told me it was clear and that the issue had been identified and that it would not happen again. I said, "What was the issue?" He said, "Someone testing perimeter, sending a message." I said, "Soren Kale." He said, "Not directly. Someone in the structure who has not yet accepted the situation." I said, "And will they accept it?" He said, "Mr. Voss will ensure it." He left. I went inside my shop. I sat behind the counter. I looked at my plants and my flowers and my dried botanicals and the paperbark cherry branch I had kept back for myself, the one I had not brought to the estate, and I thought very carefully about what I was in the middle of and whether I had made the right choice. I thought, the door is the same color. The shop is intact. My plants are fine. I thought, someone stood outside my shop in the dark and repainted a door to make me feel small, and the only thing they managed to do was make the door look slightly too fresh. I thought, I've rebuilt things before. I'm not afraid of this. I called Dorian. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Your people came. The shop is fine. I am fine." He said, "I know." I was notified. I said, "I want to talk about this tonight, about what this looks like going forward. The real version, not the protected version. I want to understand the actual landscape." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. Come tonight. I will tell you whatever you want to know." I said, "Everything." He said, "Everything." I went that evening, and he did tell me everything, which was considerable, and which I will not reproduce here in its entirety, because some of it was not mine to reproduce, and some of it was the kind of information that changed the texture of the air around you when you receive it. And I am still, even now, deciding how to carry it. What I will tell you is this. The landscape was complicated, and it was real, and it was not the kind of thing that resolved quickly or cleanly. Josh and Dorian told me all of it without softening any part of it, without making it easier to hear than it actually was, and I sat across from him in the small, warm room, and I listened to all of it, and I did not leave. When he finished, I said, "You have been managing this since you were 26. He said, "Since I was younger than that in practice, if not officially." I said, "Alone." He said, "Mostly." I said, "Your mother knew what the family was." He said, "Yes. She chose to see other things about it when she could. The garden, the house, the parts that were not about what the business required. She said that everything has two faces, and you choose which one you look at." I said, "And you?" He said, "I look at both. I've never found it useful to pretend the second face does not exist." I said, "I know. That is why I trust you." He looked at me. I said, "You did not soften this for me. You could have. I would not have known the difference. You told me the actual version and let me decide what to do with it. That is not something people do when they are trying to keep you. That is something people do when they respect you enough to let you leave if you need to." He said, "I would not have been able to watch you leave." I said, "I know that too." "But you would have let me." He said, "Yes." I said, "That matters to me more than almost anything else." We sat with that for a while. The fire moved. Outside, the December cold pressed against the windows, and inside the house was warm and smelled of cedar and the paperbark cherry and whatever was left of the evening tea. I said, "I'm not leaving." He said, "I know." I said, "But I want one thing. He said, tell me. I said, the shop stays mine. The decisions about the shop, the arrangements, the hours, what I plant and what I cut and what I keep and what I let fall, that stays mine. I understand that the world around the shop has changed. I am not naive about what the declaration means or what the protection requires. But inside the green door, that is still Calamcio's business. I want that to be understood. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, yes. I said, formally understood. He said, I will make it explicit. I said, thank you. He said, you repaint that door every spring. I said, yes. He said, what color? I said, the same green, just fresh. He said, I would like to see that. I looked at him. The fire was on his face, and his expression was the open one, the unguarded one. And he was looking at me the way he looked at the anemones and the seed pod and the paper bark cherry, with that private attention that did not belong to the rest of his life. I said, then come in spring. He said, yes. The second hard thing was Soren Kale himself. It happened in January on a Tuesday morning when I was opening the shop. He came alone, which surprised me, without the careful buffer of men that powerful people usually arrange around themselves when they move through the world. He came in when I turned the sign from close to open, as though he had been waiting outside for exactly that moment, which I suspected he had. He stood in the middle of my shop and looked at the arrangements in the display cases and did not say anything for a long moment. I stood behind the counter and waited. He said, the Lunaria. What in the hallway at the estate? That was your work. I said, yes. He said, my wife kept Lunaria. She called it honesty plant. Said you cannot pretend with it because it shows its whole structure when it dries. Nothing hidden. I said, that is true. The seed pods are translucent. You can see through them. He said, she has been dead for 11 years. I said, I am sorry. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dorian's mother and my wife were friends. Did you know that? I said, no. He said, they had adjacent gardens. They used to argue about the right conditions for growing things. His mother said patience. My wife said attention. They were probably both right. He looked at a cluster of dried lunaria I had hanging near the window. He said, I am not here to threaten you. I want you to understand that. I'm here because I needed to see what kind of person you are without Dorian in the room. I said, and he said, you are not afraid of me. You are not afraid of me in the meeting, and you are not afraid of me now, which is either very stupid or very considered, and you do not strike me as stupid. I said, I am afraid of you. I want to be accurate about that. You are a man who uses people as pressure points, and you have made it clear that you understand what I am to Dorian. That is frightening. But fear and action are not the same thing. I chose to open my shop this morning the same way I choose to open it every morning because this is mine, and I built it, and someone painting my door in the dark does not change that. He looked at me for a long time. He said, the painting of the door. That was not my instruction. I want to be clear about that also. I said, whose instruction was it? He said, it has been handled. You will not have that problem again from that particular direction. I said, and from other directions. He said, that is what I am here to assess. I said, and your assessment? He said, Dorian has not been compromised. He has been augmented. There is a difference. A compromised person makes decisions based on vulnerability. An augmented person makes decisions based on something worth protecting. The second is more stable, not less. I was wrong to call it what I called it. He paused. Do not tell him I said that. I almost smiled. I said, I will not tell him you said that. He looked at the lunaria again. He said, I will take one of those. If they are for sale. I said, everything in the shop is for sale. He said, how much? I named a price. He paid it without comment. He took the lunaria bundle with both hands carefully, the way Dorian always took things I gave him, and I noticed this and felt something complicated about it. At the door he paused. He said, you were right that the seed pods are translucent. My wife used to say you could read the whole plant's intentions through them if you looked carefully enough. He left. I stood in the middle of my shop for a moment, and then I called Dorian, and I said, Soren Kale just bought lunaria from my shop. There was a pause. Then Dorian said, how did he pay? I said, full price, cash, no argument. Another pause. Then Dorian said very quietly, I said, what does mean? He said, it means the situation has changed in our favor. Do not ask me how I know. Just trust me that it has. I said, your entire world communicates in a language I'm still learning. He said, you're learning faster than anyone I have ever watched. I said, is that a compliment? He said, it is a fact. I said, in your world, are those the same thing? He said, sometimes. I put the phone down and I went back to work. Spring came slowly to Silvergate District, the way it always does in a city that sits near enough to the water that the cold lingers past its welcome. But it came. The mornings got lighter by increments so small you only notice them in retrospect, one day realizing that the dawn was arriving before you expected it, that the birds outside the shop window had increased their noise, that the first shipment of spring botanicals from the market carried things that had not been available for months. Where the paperbark cherry at the estate put out its blossoms in March. I was there for the Friday delivery when the first ones opened, small white clusters against the copper bark, exactly as I had described them to Dorian in the small room by the fire in November, when the tree had been bare, and I had told him it waits. He was standing in the entrance hall when I came in, and he was looking at the branch in the vase, and the blossoms were open, and his expression was the open one, the unguarded one. He said, you were right. I said, it just needed time. He looked at me. Then he looked at the blossoms, then back at me. He said, yes. The green door of my shop was due for its spring repainting. I'd been doing it myself every year with the same tin of paint from the hardware store 2 streets over, the same brush, on the same afternoon of standing back and assessing the evenness. I told Dorian about it the week before I planned to do it, not as an invitation, but as information. The way I'd started to share the small particulars of my days with him, not because he needed to know, but because telling him felt like the right thing to do with things that mattered to me. He said, Saturday. I said, yes. He said, I will come. I said, you do not need to come. He said, I know. He came. He arrived at the shop at 9 in the morning in a car that was not one of the usual ones, something smaller and less conspicuous, and he was dressed in dark trousers and a gray shirt with the sleeves already rolled, and he stood on the pavement outside Bloom and Thorn and looked at the door that needed painting, and then he looked at me. I handed him a brush. Right, he looked at the brush. He said, you want me to paint the door? I said, you came to see it. Seeing involves participation. He said, I have not painted a door in my life. I said, it is not complicated. The brush goes from the top to bottom. You try not to leave streaks. He took the brush. He painted. He was predictably precise about it, the same precise attention he brought to everything, and the result was very good for someone who had never painted a door in his life. We worked from opposite sides and met in the middle and stood back and looked at the green door of Bloom and Thorn, fresh and even, and exactly the color it was supposed to be. He said, same color as last year. I said, yes. He said, why the same color, every year? I said, because it is right. You do not change something correct just for the sake of change. And he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you told me that. I said, I told you that about the orchids on the landing, the first time I was in the house? He said, yes. We were standing very close. The paint smell was around us, and the spring morning was cool and bright, and the street was starting to fill with Saturday people, who paid no attention to 2 men standing in front of a newly painted green door. He said, Callum. I said, yes. He said, I would like to do this every year. I said, paint the door. He said, all of it. The door. Whatever comes before it and after it. The shop and the lunaria, the Fridays and the Wednesdays, the small warm room. All of it. Every year. For as many years as there are. I looked at the door. I looked at the paintbrush in my hand. I thought about the bonding declaration in the formal room with the dark table and how that had been precise and official and correct in its way, but how this Saturday morning on the pavement outside my shop with paint on his sleeve and the spring light coming down between the buildings felt more true than any formal declaration. I said, yes, all right. He said, that is all. Just yes, all right. I said, you told me once you are not practiced at wanting things that are not tactical. He said, yes. I said, I'm telling you that you do not need to be practiced at it. You just need to keep showing up with paint on your sleeve. He looked at his sleeve. There was green paint on it. He looked back at me with an expression that was the open one, but also something additional, something I had not seen before, or something that was quieter than warmth and more permanent. He said, I can do that. I said, I know you can. Inside the shop, the lunaria hung near the window with its seed pods translucent in the spring light. The paperbark cherry branches were due to be replaced at the estate with fresh summer arrangements. The orchids on the landing were still exactly as they had been, still correct, still unchanged, because some things do not need to be different to be right. In the months that followed, Sorenkale retired from his position. This was not a coincidence, and it was not entirely peaceful, but it happened. And the person who took his place was someone Dorian had worked with for a long time, someone whose understanding of the structure was practical rather than proprietary. The pressure on the outside of my life eased by degrees, and the men stationed near the shop became less visible, and eventually not visible at all. Not because the protection was removed, but because it was no longer necessary to make it obvious. Reston stopped greeting me at the door. He started bringing me tea when I arrived. It happened once, 4 months into the new arrangement, and I was so startled that I did not say anything at all. And he set the cup down on the counter near my arrangement boxes, and looked at me with his carefully neutral expression, which I had now spent long enough learning to read that I could identify the specific variation that meant he was pleased with himself. I said, "Reston." He said, "Mr. Seo." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Mr. Voss mentioned your preferred blend." I said, "Of course he did." Reston said he mentioned it several months ago, actually, and when he first started having tea prepared for your Wednesday visits. I said, "He had the tea ready before I agreed to stay." Reston said, "Yes." I said he knew I would say yes. Reston said, "He was optimistic." I looked at Reston. Reston looked at me. His expression shifted by precisely 2 millimeters. It was a smile. The smallest, most controlled, most carefully rationed smile I had ever seen on a human face. It lasted 1.5 seconds. Then he turned and went back down the hallway, and I stood there with my arrangement boxes and my tea and my absurd, thorough, complete happiness. And I thought about a man who picks up anemones with both hands and puts moon coins on windowsills and was optimistic enough to have the tea prepared before he asked. I put my boxes down. I picked up the tea. I went to find him. He was in the library. He was reading something, his attention on the page, his dark hair catching the morning light from the tall windows. He did not look up immediately when I came in, and so for a moment I stood in the doorway and I looked at him without him knowing I was looking, the way you look at something you are still slightly astonished to have, the way you look at a paperbark cherry tree in March when the blossoms have finally opened. He looked up. His expression moved through something when he saw me standing there with the tea he had ordered prepared months before I agreed to stay for it. I said, "You had the tea ready." He said, "Yes." I said, "You were optimistic." He said, "I prefer to think of it as accurate." I said, "Accurate." He said, "You were going to stay. You had already decided, you just had not admitted it yet." Warming the tea was simply correct preparation. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "You know, the first time I came to this house, I thought you were going to be exactly what everyone said you were. Cold, closed, dangerous in a way that left no room for anything else." He said, and I said, "And then you picked up the anemones." He said, "They were an interesting combination." I said, "You picked them up the way you pick up something you are afraid of damaging." He was quiet. I said, "That is the thing about you, Dorian. You are careful with things that matter to you. You are the most careful person I have ever met. Everything you do is deliberate and considered and done with full attention. That is what I saw. That is what I kept coming back for. Not the house or the estate or the cedar and smoke of you, although all of those things are considerable." He stood up from behind the desk. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of me and he looked at me with the expression that I had all of now. The complete open version, nothing underneath it that I could not read. He said, "You called me cute." I said, "You were." "You are. You are also about 15 other things that are significantly more complicated than cute, but cute is still accurate." He said, "It sent my entire organization into a silence that lasted approximately 20 seconds. I said, "I know. I was there." He said, "Reston told me afterward that he had never seen anything like it. He said it was like watching someone walk up to a fire and offer it a flower." I said, "And what did the fire do?" He said the fire apparently was unexpectedly affected. I smiled. He looked at my smile and the corner of his mouth moved, the underground movement, and it came all the way up. The same small, real smile I'd seen in the van in December. And it stayed longer this time, warm and private and absolutely for me. I said, "I am going to spend a significant amount of time over the coming years making that happen more often." He said, "I expect you will." I said, "You are not objecting." He said, "No." I put the tea down on the edge of the desk and I reached up and put my hand against his jaw, which was the sharp jaw that cast shadows in afternoon light. And he turned his face into my hand the way a tree turns toward light, Not because it chooses to, but because the chemistry of it is simply correct, and I thought, there it is. Or there's the thing I've been growing toward since the very first Tuesday morning when you walked into my shop and picked up the anemones. He covered my hand with his. His thumb traced the line of my knuckles. He said, "Stay tonight." I said, "Yes." He said, "Stay tomorrow." I said, "I have deliveries." He said, "In the afternoon, stay in the morning." I said, "All right." He said, "Stay in general, permanently. Whatever arrangement makes sense for the shop, we will find one. But stay here. This house has been too large for one person for longer than I have wanted to admit." I looked at him. He looked at me. Outside the library windows, the city moved in its usual way, traffic and light and the distant sound of the port. And inside this room in this house it was warm and smelled of cedar and books and faintly from somewhere. "I'm on the paperbark cherry." I said, "I will need to bring my plants." He said, "Yes." I said, "Some of them are large." He said, "I have a garden." I said, "I will need a workroom." "Somewhere for the arrangement work." He said, "There is a room off the kitchen with a north-facing window." "I had it emptied 3 weeks ago." I said, 3 weeks ago." He said, "I was being optimistic." I laughed, clear and genuine, the way I had laughed in the van in December, the way I had laughed at his precise and careful painting of my door. He watched me laugh with that expression that was more than warm and more permanent than anything I had a clean word for. I said, "All right." He said, "All right." I said, "We are doing this." He said, "We have been doing this for some time. You are simply acknowledging it." I said, "You are insufferable." He said, "Yes. You called me cute in front of 6 of my men. We are perhaps not ideally suited for a quiet life." I said, "And yet." He said, "And yet." He pulled me toward him, and I went without any resistance at all, and his arms came around me, and his chin rested on the top of my head, and we stood like that in the library in the morning light, with the city outside the windows, and the paperbark cherry in the hall, and the workroom with the north-facing window awaiting, 3 weeks emptied and ready. I thought about the first morning, the black car and the mat cart, and the man who did not belong in my shop, but who had walked in anyway and ordered soup, and then looked at the anemones and picked them up with both hands. I thought about the way the room had felt that first Tuesday, full of something I could not name yet, something that was not danger exactly, though it was adjacent to it. Something that was instead the specific electricity of two things being drawn toward each other that have been apart too long. I thought about the lunaria scattering its moon coins on the floor, and the seed pod on the windowsill, and the fire in the small warm room, and the green door freshly painted, and a man who was optimistic enough to have the tea prepared before he asked. I thought, this is what patience grows into. This is what you find on the other side of the winter. And I thought, I am so glad I said it. Out loud, to his face, in front of everyone, I am so glad I called him cute. Because the room went dead silent, and he sent them all away. And that silence was the first second of everything that came after. Outside the windows of the Voss estate, spring was finishing what it had started. The paperbark cherry in the hall had dropped its blossoms and put out new leaves, small and bright and reaching toward whatever light was available. The lunaria along the windowsill had been replaced with something new. Something I had chosen that morning from the back of my shop, dark hellebores and pale astrantia, and one long branch of something that caught the light from a slightly different angle than anything that had been there before. Dorian came to look at it before the tea arrived. He stood in the hallway and he looked at the arrangement for a long time. Then he said, "Why the astrantia?" I said, "The hellebores are almost black." "The astrantia is the thing that prevents the arrangement from becoming heavy. It is the breath inside it," he said, "in the branch." I said, "That is new." "It is serviceberry. It has already bloomed this season, but the branch structure is extraordinary, the way it divides and then divides again, each split balanced. It will not need to be replaced for weeks. The branch would outlast all the arrangements around it, patient and structural and exactly right. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. My beautiful heaven angels, tell me your thoughts in the comments. Which part moved you the most, and where can I improve? I love reading and replying to every single one of your comments. It means everything to me. Let's meet again next time with a better story. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful time.